What API abstractions are useful, or do you think are useful? What network abstractions? Forget I said API, okay? What network abstractions have you found useful, or do you think will be useful?
I think we're going to go, there's two questions there that I think of. The first one that I think of is we're going through the phase of static abstractions. So overlays, manually defined. Overlays defined from point to point. APIs that are statically defined. You put a REST command in and a defined response comes back. That's the first generation of abstractions. We're also seeing abstractions, although this starts to get into disaggregation, where the operating system is no longer dependent on the hardware. They can be taken apart, right? So and those are part of this API question to some extent. I think but more importantly, I think we need to look into the future to understand why we have static abstractions as opposed to dynamic abstractions. So if you look at where Yang and NetConf are going, they're going into creating models that dynamically express the APIs that they're trying to create. So you can write a software query, make a NetConf request, and it will come back and tell you what it's going to respond with, the format of the data and the payload and the purpose behind the API, so that the applications can dynamically negotiate with the device or the endpoint about what API it should use. So first of all, you have to understand that an API is request, get a response. Then you have to understand the response. The first phase is static, and then the second phase is dynamic. That is, it's a negotiated process where you get back varying responses according to the request.
Yeah, I think it starts with lower level data models that are common, for things that we all know, interfaces, VLANs, things like that, to build out a common model across devices.
So for example,
abstraction.
Yeah. So for example, the VLAN is an abstraction of the big gold cable that Greg and I used to run.
Yeah, but I think on top of that, it's ideal to think of it as maybe a VLAN is a tenant, maybe it's something else, and I think we need common primitives before we can kind of get to that level. So I personally think right now in this day and age, we need to standardize
on the simple thing
of the modeling of the common constructs that have been there for 20 years before we jump ahead and try to change and create these crazy architectures, right?
Are we going to get that from vendors?
No, and again, OpenConfig is a good example of trying to do some of this with model some of these constructs out across vendors driven by operators and users. But they're trying to develop common Yang models for things that we all know and love, right? VLANs, interfaces, routing policies, things like that, both for telemetry data and config data. And once that's done, then we can do some higher level services that reside on top, right? And that's where we can get cool things like, if it's whatever we want to call, whatever service makes sense, but we need those common constructs before we get to that level, in my opinion. I don't know.
I think we need to make simplicity a must.
Yeah.
I think we need to really, really focus on quality in design, quality of software, and simplicity above all. I mean, if the first session that we had wasn't enough of an indicator, complexity really confuses the hell out of us, and we need to start simplifying things. And as we move into these these programmatic interfaces, I think we need to carry that forward. As to your point, focusing on the basics, making sure we have that done well. Stop trying to sprint towards that fancy feature that the one or two customers need. Let's do this right. Let's build this from the ground up and do it right.
That's it, I guess.
It's an evolving. Once again, it took me 30 years to build my career up to the point that I am whatever it is I am now. Nothing's going to change this year or next year. It's going to be 5 years for APIs to reach a point of evolution until they're stable. And we talked about the confusion behind naming SDN. Still, it's only been 4 years. Most people buy their networks for 15. 10 years would be the typical life cycle of an Ethernet switch in a data center. So let's not expect things to change overnight. Let's just calm the hell down.
Well, I think one abstraction that we saw this week was SD-WAN. It's basically just providing a WAN pipe. Hide the complexity of all the stuff underneath it. So there's one example that's pretty straightforward.
I think though too, sometimes the abstraction is not the right thing. Like we've all kind of talked about here, like when you boil everything down, we're doing the same thing, right? We're doing layer 2 bridging, we're doing all this stuff, we're just doing it in a different, clever way. And that's why like things like VXLAN to me, I mean like, we take that and then we abstract that into a tenant, and to like the end user or the business that wants to consume the network for us, I don't think we're doing them any favors. I think those abstractions, sometimes we just need to be like, we need a VRF. We have these basic constructs, this is what we can provide you from the network, and it doesn't do much good to abstract them much further than that.